I'd like to welcome you all to another event in AUB's Arab Uprising lecture series. Is this microphone okay? I'm Waleed. Can you hear me? What's going on? I'm Waleed Hezboun. I teach international relations here at AUB and direct CAIMS, the AUB Center for Arab and Middle Eastern Studies. Tonight's event is a joint venture between CAIMS and the Issam Fares Institute for Public Policy and International Affairs, which has helped coordinate the Arab Uprising lecture series. Most critically, this event would have not been possible without another co-sponsor, the Netherlands Institute in Beirut, which is responsible for bringing our speaker to Beirut. Tonight's speaker is Professor Reinoud, Leenders, who is Assistant Professor of Political Science at the University of Amsterdam. He earned his PhD at SOAS and previously was Middle East analyst for International Crisis Group. And before that, Beirut correspondent for Middle East International. As an academic, he has published several articles and book chapters on Iraqi refugees, the political economy of Lebanon, and authoritarianism in Syria. He is the co-editor of the forthcoming book, Comparative Authoritarianisms, Reconfiguring Power and Regime Resilience in Syria and Iran. He is also author of a soon-to-be-published book by Cornell University Press entitled Spoils of Truce, Corruption and State Building in Post-War Lebanon. Like others, I am sure Professor Leenders has views about the ongoing events in Syria and the question of outside intervention, but tonight's not really a forum for that. CAIMS will have a future event looking at the question in Libya and more broadly at the issue of intervention in international law. And I know the Issam Fares Institute is planning a panel to discuss intervention in regional geopolitics later on in the spring. Rather, the focus of tonight's presentation is to explore the dynamics of collective action and popular mobilization, which are critical issues at the heart of all the Arab uprisings. So the title of the talk is Collective Action and Popular Mobilization in Beirut, an anatomy of the onset of Syria's popular uprising. Please join me in welcoming Professor Reinoud.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for your kind introduction. Particularly so because I now learned that I got promotion and became professor. I only thought I was assistant professor, but I'm very pleased about that. Before I get to the point, always be aware when academicians start their talk like that, but before I get to the point, please allow me to have some philosophical reflections on the passing of time. The passing of time is a strange thing. I think we all have a very strange, sometimes peculiar relationship with how we conceive of time. I'm saying that thinking about remembering when I was sitting in Damascus, actually with the director of the Dutch Institute in Syria, Reconfiguring. And I was on a mission in Syria in December 2010, and I tried to understand the resilience of the Syrian authoritarian regime, particularly with reference to the role of the business class and business groups. Basically thinking, embarrassingly now, that this regime will basically remain stable and not see any mobilization in the foreseeable future. And so it's kind of the imagined futures in the past are probably the most embarrassing, particularly for those academicians who are coming from this approach. Now, it's not just the future that poses some embarrassments. It's also how we read the past, and even the recent past, and particularly so in reference to how we think of revolutions and uprisings. Mostly revolutions and uprisings are being seen as one event, and mostly the questions that are being asked are about the causes that precede these events. So in the Syrian context, of course, many have indeed raised this question, and the answers have varied from a breach of an unwritten social contract, foreign policies that are being disapproved of, increased poverty, and so on. Now the problem with this approach, although there's still a lot to be said about having a discussion about its ultimate causes that precede revolutions, the problem is that the revolution, or the uprising rather, is seen as one neat event. And if you look back in the past at the beginnings of a revolution, they are viewed in light of current developments, what happened now, and not being analyzed on their own terms. Now that's exactly what I propose to do today, by looking at the onset of the Syrian uprising, which happened to occur in Dara, a relatively remote place, at least in people's heads, including Syrians, in the unlikely governorate of Dara, close to the Jordanian border. It's a place that is hardly on has been hardly on anybody's screen. Journalists didn't go there. There was fairly nothing to report for them. And even if you talk to regime officials, hardly ever Dara would come up. And in fact, in my own research on other topics, only once Dara was mentioned, and that was because the United Nations Development Programme, had a kind of pilot project there for building a more efficient and a more effective judiciary, which happened to be in Dara. And when I asked somebody at the time from the UNDP, well, why Dara? And he told me probably the regime gave permission for that because it was the kind of the least volatile and the least dangerous place to have potentially controversial projects like reforming the judiciary. Now, I'm going to give you the bare bones of an argument I have been developing and which I have translated into an article which I'm already told I should be cutting down on. So if you want to hear more than just the bare bones, please do raise questions during the Q&A or indeed leave your email address and I'll send you a copy of the article that will be published in a journal called Mobilization, an academic journal, Mobilization. What I tried to do in the article is to heed calls, recent calls by several researchers and scholars working on the Middle East following the Arab uprisings, to have a closer look at social movement theory and see what we can learn from it, whether we can use any concepts to better understand the Arab uprisings. Now, by doing so, I also benefited from a few scholars, and there are a fair few, who already did this and already tried to use social movement theory, often critically or even dismissively, in the pre-uprising period. First, what I will be doing is I will be looking at so-called political opportunity structures, and that's a concept that is often being used by social movement theorists. Subsequently, I will be looking at the social networks that made, in my view, mobilization possible through helping to shape cognitive frameworks, providing resources, skills, and social capital to bring about mass discontent and anger to the streets of Dara city and its environments. And also to see, to make the argument in the conclusion that not so much key agents or pivotal actors were here at play and instrumental in bringing about at least the earlier stages of the mobilization, variously called conspirators by the regime or brokers by the theorists, but mobilization was much more embedded in the social networks and can be explained by these social networks. In my paper, I have an entire section on the use of sources, because that, of course, is posing a bit of a problem, even more so than usually when one studies in an authoritarian context like that of Syria. I haven't been able to go to Dara recently, so let's get that out of the way. But I've instead tried to analyze tons of YouTube material, in addition to having Skype conversations with people still in Dara, and indeed also with people who fled Dara subsequently after the demobilization occurred and the regime repression really set in. I can say maybe a little bit more about the merits and pitfalls of relying on such sources in the Q&A. About the opportunity structures. Now, basically, in a nutshell, and cutting some corners, social movement theory argues that people mobilize, rise up, or engage in contentious and often risky collective actions. Indeed, when the opportunities arise and radically change to engage in such risky undertakings. So, following events in Tunisia and Egypt, closer to home, at least to Dara, a sense of such perceived changes in opportunity structures, of course, was palpable throughout Syria. Recall remarks made by Reinoud, the communist leader in Syria, who was basically, I believe in early February, already wondering, well, it won't be long before the uprisings and the revolutions will be knocking on the doors of this huge Syrian prison, as he called it. Lots of people throughout Syria were making comparisons between the regimes, the Tunisian, the Egyptian, and the Syrian regimes, indeed to understand or to speculate about the prospects of such a thing also occurring in Syria. And indeed, Bashar al-Assad responded in kind in this famous or infamous interview in the Wall Street Journal, arguing that Syria was indeed exceptional and was very different from Egypt and Tunisia. Now, the kind of conventional argument would be that there was a demonstration effect. Some have used this rather medical, ugly word of contagion to kind of capture this mechanism. Basically trying to argue that changes abroad in nearby countries basically affected the opportunity structures as they are or were perceived in Syria itself in this case. Now, the problem, of course, with this kind of analysis is that it doesn't explain why mobilization began and where it started and how it started. Indeed, there's nothing inevitable about it. Opportunities could have been overlooked. In a way, they could not have been perceived or internalized. They could have been ignored. They could have been wasted. Or they could have been overshadowed by other sentiments and perceptions, namely a fear of repression and regime violence. Or indeed, more generally, a fear for an uncertain, messy future for the country that would come about after mobilization. Now, the same can be said about repression. Social movement theory also argues that threat levels also have an impact on the willingness or the propensity of people to engage in collective action and collective contentious action. Repression, there's nothing inevitable about that either. Instead of triggering or even more anger and hence mobilization, regime repression could also have nipped mobilization in the bud or prevented it altogether. And yet it didn't, as events in March 2011 in Dara clearly demonstrated. So, in short, we need something else, an additional focus to explain why, how, and where people rose up against authoritarian rule. But first, a few observations about the opportunity structures and the threat levels or repression in Dara, in that particular place where it all started.
Dara is a peculiar place. It has always been viewed, particularly in terms of perceptions, it's always been viewed by regime incumbents and the more established opposition activists alike as perhaps the most unlikely place for anti-regime challenges to occur. And indeed, in early 2011, all eyes were set within these discussions about, is it going to happen here in Syria? All eyes were set on the bigger cities, or perhaps even the northeast, that already witnessed much more contentious politics in the past, in the recent past. In contrast, Dara was seen as a backward, perhaps even boring, isolated place, populated by peasants, preoccupied with their harsh lives and trying to make ends meet. The very denial of modern politics that, and modern statehood that both regime incumbents and more conventional opposition activists liked to talk about. And indeed, it took even a few months after the uprisings that I spoke to Syrian opposition activists in exile who still denied that the revolution had, or the uprising had started in Dara, but rather referred to their own activities in key cities like Damascus. Now, on top of all this, Dara was also viewed as part of the regime's constituency and support base in the Sunni community. Farmers benefited from Ba'ath-initiated land reforms. People from Dara benefited also from disproportionately, some say, from civil service employment. And indeed, it seems a disproportionately large contingent of Dara families ended up in the list of high-ranking government politicians and civil servants. Now, I would argue that to some extent, although it's not a sufficient explanation, but to some extent these perceptions of Dara as being a marginal place, irrelevant, not happening, help to explain why indeed Dara became an early riser, exactly because all eyes were set on places elsewhere. There is some anecdotal evidence in this context, for example, that a lot of the presence of the military and police in Dara was actually reduced in these kind of months of these 2 short months of discussion about is it going to happen in Syria as well, and were kind of transferred to more urban areas, including Damascus. Now, concerning fear and repression, Daraawis initially responded to a chain of local events. Most of that, I assume, you are probably familiar with. The arrest of a local female doctor, Aisha Abu Zaid, who was overheard by the Mukhabarat making derogatory remarks about Bashar in the wake of Mubarak's resignation in Egypt. The arrest of another woman from an important Dara family in Damascus when she attended protests, early kind of small-scale protests there. The school children writing graffiti on the walls of the Arba'in school in Dara city, their arrest and torture. Efforts by an MP representing Dara in parliament to bring about the release of the children, to which the local Mukhabarat chief Atif Najib responded with scorn and even more heavy-handedness. So probably people in the Mukhabarat must have thought, why aren't these people getting the message? Why are they not deterred by our threat of repression? And yet the protests swelled and quickly acquired a recurring rhythm as funerals followed protests and protests followed funerals. So again, we are stuck in our attempt to understand why and how Daraawis persisted in their anti-regime collective mobilization. Now, I think to fully understand why it happened anyway and at such a scale and at such a persistence, we have to turn to social networks. That idea is not just coming from me. In fact, a couple of social movement theorists have responded to what they saw as the shortcoming of this political opportunity structures approach by focusing exactly on social networks. And some have argued that especially in the context of tightly controlled and surveyed authoritarian regimes like Syria, I should add, where any form of collective action and organization is being repressed, co-opted, or otherwise undermined by authoritarian regimes, such networks become important as the only kind of space, social and public, social space where people can come together. So from a social network perspective, what can then be found in data in terms of social networks that may be of relevance to our analysis and our attempt to understand mobilization and the onset of mobilization there? Now, first of all, and certainly not wanting to reduce it to these kind of networks, but I think to tribal and more correctly, and I can say a bit more about that, the clan structures of Dara, city and governorate are of importance. There are basically only a couple of extended families or clans in Dara that have acquired prominence. The Abu Zaid, the Zorbis, the Hariris, the Masalmas, the Muqdads, the Jawabra and Mahamid clans in particular, and there are a couple of smaller clans as well. Now, in a nutshell, what do they do? Why are they important? They generate a sense and mechanisms of solidarity, identity, and are also a source of socio-economic coping and survival. In addition to that, they generate values. They are being sustained and generated in these environments. And also, they provide mechanisms for local conflict management and the settlement of disputes. Often even acquiring a kind of extrajudicial or extra-legal qualities. A second set of networks that I think have been of importance for mobilization concerns the networks built around the region's, Dara's major source of income, circular labor migration, and the remittances that this generated. Dara has always been a region that produced a lot of labor migrants, and particularly circular labor migrants, so people who went abroad, particularly to Lebanon, to some extent Lebanon and the Gulf, for temporary work, and basically kept their homes in Dara and their families, and also kept their kind of social ties with their families, and went back and forth in visiting and so on. Often, this kind of labor, circular labor migration is taking place, made possible and facilitated by networks, informally, often overlapping with the clan and extended family networks. So there are no official employment agencies, but instead the social networks and clans basically help people from abroad who for the first time go to Beirut, for example, or other places in Lebanon, and find shelter for them or housing, and even put them in touch with potential employers. So networks take all care of this. It also involves a degree of street smartness and a kind of social capital that manages, or that gives people the ability to operate in environments that are often semi-legal or illegal. Well, you probably know much more about this than me, but the presence of Syrian workers, of course, has always been a controversial affair, and often mainly happens in a kind of shadowy, quasi-legal environment or context. In Jordan, it often is straightforward illegal, as the Jordanians are very stingy with work permits to Syrians, and have always been. So that requires it requires contacts and networks in the country that manage to circumvent all these obstacles. Now, a third set of networks, and you probably noticed already that they all are somehow interrelated, which is an important point, about which later. A third set of networks pertains to the cross-border traffic and communication. Obviously, Daraa is very close to the Jordanian border, and its economy, next to the remittances sent by labor migrants, very much depends on cross-border trade and traffic. So it involves all sorts of characters and trades. Truck drivers who go back and forth and bring agricultural produce from Sueda and the Daraa areas to markets in Ramtha, for example, or in Irbid. There are many taxi drivers. Others operate illegal taxis. They are called Bahara, or the sailors. And there are many other trade links between Daraa, Ramtha, and Irbid. So most of these economic activities, legal or illegal, and indeed I forgot to mention smuggling, of course, occurs via social networks, linking traders, truck drivers, and all these people I mentioned before, and family clan members, money exchangers, smugglers, and indeed also corrupt customs officials with each other in order to make this kind of local economy, or this borderland economy, possible. And finally, and probably most controversially, there's a set of networks that can be characterized criminal, between quotation marks, because let's face it, what does it mean to be a criminal in an authoritarian regime where the rule of law does not apply, or at least not in ways that are always so clear to everybody. If you look at the Syrian state statistics, and even if we take it with a pinch of salt when it comes to absolute numbers, in relative terms, it's remarkable to see that Daraa basically exceeds crime levels of all the other governorates. In fact, if we want to believe these statistics, Daraa is responsible for 22% of the country's convictions involving mostly petty crime. And that for Daraa's population of only 7% of the total population of Syria. Now, anecdotal evidence support this. And perhaps it may not also not be so surprising that crime levels are high in Daraa, particularly taking into account its location and the borderland qualities of its economy. It's not the only borderland that has high crime rates. Now, crime, again, also not only in Daraa but elsewhere as well, involves networks of trust that can substitute for the market exchange, more open market exchange involving non-criminal economic activities. It requires requires behavioral codes, patterns of trust, specific mechanisms and skills to survive in a risky and volatile environment. Now the Daraawis have found a solution for that. And basically invented the notion of what they call in their own dialect, if I pronounce it correctly, the notion of the phenomenon of the Zegid. And I have understood by listening to people from Daraa that this is basically more or less the equivalent of what in more Levantine Arabic or in Lebanese Arabic is called the Abadai, the trickster in English, the kind of tough guy who manages to get involved in crime, benefit, and basically outsmart the police forces and anybody opposing him. Now, I found one Sigurd who had fled the country after having been involved first in collective mobilization and then even armed struggle against the Syrian army. Let's call him Mohammed. Mohammed was somebody who was known to be a Zegid. And he had a lot of guts, basically, and a risk taker. He was, for example, known for impersonating a mukhabarat agent, and this way, when there was a long queue in front of some public sector state office, basically jumped the queue and instructed poor public servants to do X, Y, Z, and give him a privileged treatment, in other words. He was also known for slapping mukhabarat agents when he got arrested for petty crime. So it's somebody who has a lot of guts, takes risks, and basically has a network of people of likewise sigits who are involved in organized crime, I wouldn't call it, but are involved in a sustained effort involving a petty crime, stealing mobile phones, selling them like that, things like that, smuggling fuel, cigarettes, and stuff like that. Now, I've already said this while I was going through this list of relevant social networks for mobilization. It's important to note that all of these social networks, they overlap, they are somehow intertwined. The labor migration has a kind of criminal or quasi-criminal side to it. The border traffic is also communicating and benefiting from clan structures, noting the kind of cross-border nature of these clans. The families in Aramtha and Andara are connected. So now, let us now return with this background to our initial remarks on opportunity and threat repression first. First of all, I would argue that opportunities coming from abroad, i.e. Things happening in Egypt, the fall of Mubarak and so on, they have to be recognized first. They have to be seen as relevant to us, to here, where we live. And I think this kind of perceptions and this cognitive process was being facilitated by the transnational qualities of Dara and its networks. It explains that opportunities were read from what basically was a foreign script happening and written in Egypt and Tunisia. And also it contrasts these initial perceptions that I kind of summarized of Dara as being a place isolated on its own and preoccupied with itself. In fact, people from Dara describe their place and their home as constantly active a platform of heated debates at dinner tables, talking about international and regional politics, domestic politics, and so on. So in a way it confirms some anthropologists and sociologists' findings that often those involved in mobile professions and migration, labor migration, for example, truck drivers, for example, often are, and I'm quoting James Scott, are the carriers of the hidden transcript. Narratives on repression and authoritarianism, on politics, on international politics, that crucially are being shared among people, even if there is a very restrictive and hostile authoritarian context created by a regime that tries to repress such hidden transcripts to be expressed openly or publicly. Now, secondly, I think also the networks are important for the threat and repression dimension of the story. Why do people respond in anger to repression instead of resign in submission or in fear, or refrain from mobilizing in the first place because there is this potential of repression hanging over them? I think the clan structure in particular and the values it created are of great importance. Particularly with regards to these events leading up to the mobilization and the uprising, involving the arrest of two prominent women of Dara's families in February, basically. And subsequently, the derogatory remarks made by the local Mukhabarat chief Atif Najib where he basically said in response to requests to release the school children who were arrested after the graffiti, he responded allegedly by saying, well, if you want to, I'm not going to release these children. If you want to have new children, just send us your women, and we make them conceive some more children. Now this created an outrage among Dar'awis, and basically what it meant is that the regime threats in the background of conservative and widely shared and strongly felt values on female integrity and dignity, these regime threats became a cause of action instead of a reason for submission. So it was offense, a perceived offense, instead of humble submission, that explained why the threat and repression were seen as a cause of action. Now, the ways in which collective action and mobilization subsequently developed and rose in importance and intensity, and perhaps most strikingly sustained, I would like to make two observations about that in context, in reference to the social networks that I highlighted just earlier. First of all, I think the social networks provided an important sense of solidarity and presented the background against which recruitment for mobilization took place. Now that recruitment may have been voluntarily or spontaneously rather, as basically many people who were sharing or were taking part in these networks, and particularly the clan networks, basically felt compelled to join the protests and collective action against the regime, despite the risks. At the same time, there was also a kind of quasi-involuntary element to this recruitment via these social networks, because it also imposed on members of the clans who did have higher or quasi-prominent positions in government or were performing roles that in support of the regime, actually felt compelled by their relatives to basically take sides and join the mobilization, or at least to express their reservations about the ways in which the regime responded with so much brutal force. Now, on top of this, social networks supplied the key skills and resources for mobilization to be effective and to be sustained under prohibitive conditions of massive repression. And I'm particularly thinking here of the kind of street smartness shared by people who participated in these networks involving circular labor migration, but also the criminal networks. People provided certain services, used that kind of street smartness in an attempt to outwit the repression forces. For example, the Sigit I was talking about, Mohammed, earlier, he was basically assigned to be responsible for intelligence. He had to find out exactly where the security forces were about to attack, where they were, and so on. He was also responsible for providing safe houses for activists who were wanted by the regime. Not unlike his usual trade of trying to conceal his petty criminal activities. Now, some concluding remarks on at least one part of the regime narrative, but funnily enough also a narrative that is partly being shared by social movement theorists, and I stress partly. Now, we all know that the regime has kind of tried to frame the uprising in terms of, well, this is just a movement or a bunch of people, rather, who are being instigated by conspirators. They may be foreign-backed, but they are conspirators who are not representative of anything. They are individuals, and they somehow manage to lead these people in the wrong path and to rise up against the regime. Now, it's interesting that social movement theory also has emphasized the role of key individuals, key agents of mobilization, and it's often referred to in terms of brokerage. There are brokers who are pivotal in getting people to act collectively, take risks, and go into the streets. Now, this of course is sharply in contrast with what we have come to know as the so-called leaderless revolutions throughout the Arab world. And I think it also, at least for the early stages of the Syrian uprising, this kind of leaderless equality also applies. And I think it was made largely possible by the prominence of social networks, a very fragmented way, decentralized way of mobilizing collectively, facilitated by the overlapping nature of these networks, and these networks being intertwined. So in a way, social networks, and Dada's social networks, can be seen as a substitute for all the qualities attributed to conspirators and brokers that, in my opinion, were strikingly absent during the onset of the uprising. Summing up, taking a case study of Dada as an example of an early riser at the onset of popular mobilization in Syria, I think social networks have been key. They facilitated the recognition or interpretation of events abroad as relevant to prospective mobilizers, and make these events in Egypt relevant to their own environment. In other words, opportunities were perceived and sensed, and also subsequently affected how Syrians framed their protest and their challenge to the regime. Networks also mattered in the way that regime threats and repression was being perceived. It was not a cause for submission or a reason to be deterred, but it was a cause for outrage and action, and a reason for mobilizing. Social networks also mattered because it provided a source of solidarity, recruitment of a voluntary or quasi mandatory nature or not. Networks mattered also because they supplied skills and resources for mobilization under prohibitive conditions of regime repression and authoritarianism. And finally, networks matter especially because they are overlapping and of such a complex nature, they can substitute, at least at the onset of the uprising, for brokerage and political entrepreneurship, which made it particularly difficult for the Syrian regime to repress mobilization, because basically there was no real conspirator to arrest in order to hold the mobilization at its onset. So I'm very much looking forward to your questions and comments. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you for your talk and for bringing out some of these issues about networks in a very different context than the networks of social media and plugged-in youth that we've become accustomed to. We give our speaker a moment to take a breath, but if there are questions, we can start in the back. I think, is there a roving microphone for people who are not? Should we send that to the side or the back in case there's questions over there? But otherwise, if you're at the front table, I think you push the white button to turn on your microphone to speak. So are there any questions? Anybody want to open the dialogue? Yes, thank you.
Hi, I haven't really structured this in my head, but I just thought I'd ask a question. I'm a British PhD student, also grappling with social movement theory, and I just wanted to push you a little bit on this cognitive liberation idea, because I understand from what I can get from your talk is you've taken very much a Doug McAdam 1982 kind of political opportunity structure, mobilising structure, but not so much integrated cultural framing from what initially was cognitive liberation, because the difference between exogenous subjective structures of opportunities and subjective perceptions of those opportunities, and the gap between how do you mobilise, how do you bridge that gap, the linchpin was seen as cognitive liberation. And social movement theorists still haven't really got to this, and there's an internal debate between structure agency debate and micro-macro debate, and social movement theory is no longer this coherent framework. It's more identified by the disagreements within social movement theorists at the moment. And this is one problem that I'm struggling with personally. So I wouldn't mind your comments on this idea of cognitive liberation, translating objective structures into subjective perceptions. Thanks.
You want to respond to
It was a kind of detailed question, she's like,
Okay.
Well, thank you very much for your comment. Let me start with a disclaimer. I'm not a social movement theory expert. In fact, I was working much more on authoritarian governance before and authoritarian resilience and what have you, political economy. But I recognize your question. In fact, it was asked by me by somebody who's better versed in social movement theory, as you seem to be as well. I don't pretend to resolve this issue, this discussion. This discussion, what strikes me is that there seems to be a discussion where there's a dichotomy being suggested between objective structures in political opportunity structures versus perceptions. And a more cognitive framing or discursive kind of process. And somebody remarked that these things seem to kind of be intermingled in my argument. And frankly, I hadn't really thought about it, didn't do it deliberately, but I don't see why we should artificially distinguish these two. If events in Egypt have an effect on people in Dara, it must be in terms of perceptions and in terms of cognitive framing, and that doesn't mean that there is nothing objective happening. The Egyptian revolution was happening, but what matters is that these objective things and structural changes are being perceived as such by people who eventually take the decision whether to go to the streets and take risks or not. So I'm afraid my answer is rather mundane and not really en vogue in the social movement theory debate, but I would say let's move on and go beyond this discussion, because at the end of the day, structural or kind of objective political or structural political opportunity structures don't matter if you don't bring in cognitive frameworks. Because if they are not perceived, they become irrelevant, except for maybe an academician.
The next, Fawaz have a question.
Thanks, Reinoud. I have to say I'm surprised how easily we find a solution in a theory. I mean, we are facing a real shake-up called a revolution for a whole year, which I think has shaken up, destabilized not only regimes, but regimes of idea. And yet, it's very easy to say the rationalist idea that business generates democracy doesn't work. Let's go to social network theory. Am I being harsh? One reason for this is that, and I'm surprised at a few things. First, Dar'a is taken out of context in its relationship with Syria. Dar'a is taken out of context in its relationship with Huran and all the problems of the Syrian countryside. And among the social networks, I didn't find the mosque, where all the social networks simply gathered out of an instinct of sheer self-preservation to ward off the forces of repression against them. Let me just fill in a few things. I don't know how they fit into social theory, but first, is there such an exception in Syria? I mean, in explaining what happened in Syria, could we not, for example, talk about the collapse of agriculture? Horan is the grain-producing region of Syria. What's happened to it? Is Dar'a just a contraband economy that produce? Why is there migration from Horan, the richest agricultural part of the country, for the past, how many years? 30 years, let's say, to Lebanon? That's one question. The other, Syria has 30% poverty. Syria has 30% unemployment, youth, which is common with the rest of the Arab world. Why is that important? Why isn't that, whatever we call it, why isn't that a factor in itself of rebellion? I'd just add to it what has to do with a lot of the peripheral regions of Syria, and that is many of those people were sent to Iraq to fight alongside actually Al-Qaeda, and came back armed. I know that not many left from Dar'a. I know that Dar'a was a reservoir for Sunni Ba'athis. But actually this proves exactly perhaps what I'm trying to say. If the most secure Ba'athi state region in the country manages to revolt, I think we should link, if I may, factors that led people to revolt with the general context of the revolution in Syria, and where, of course, social networks played a role, but a role which is not a causality, a role which is a fallback into forms of solidarity, which we find everywhere. I mean, you have 400, 500 places of opposition and resistance in Syria, which use a variety of techniques ranging from the most sophisticated Skype to the harada of the region, which is to dancing, to the dabki, to the so I don't see in that sense that social networks explain. Social networks are a result when people need all their forms of mobilization. They're not causal, at least their means. I don't know if I understood you well, but I think those are a few things which I think should be taken into consideration.
Thank you, Father. Sharp comments as usual. I must admit I am struggling with a couple of questions that you raised, but some of the questions you raise, and I think you numbered 3, I have 7. I noted 7 actually, but there are a couple of misunderstandings. First of all, starting with your first comment about coming up with an easy kind of answer to complex questions. So first we looked at the business community as a potential democratizer. Now we go to social networks. And I must add, some others have looked at other strata or groups or phenomenon to find the kind of lonely Democrat. That has not been my agenda. I am not trying to find the real or perceived Democrat. In fact,
if you would ask me, I have some doubts about the networks that I cited and the way they're organized being democratic in the first place. In response to the uprising in Daraa, some people have indeed in Syria, elsewhere, have also raised doubts about or feel edgy about this because they, you could argue these are not democratically organized forms of social organization. Now, I'm not making that argument explicitly because I don't know, and I don't want to raise the issue if it kind of seems to downplay the quality of the uprising. But I'm not making the argument that these social networks will bring about a democracy and are therefore a substitute for the business community or anyone else we hope to bring about democracy. A response to, or maybe a partial response to your reference to the mosque and the social networks around that. Admittedly, and that also refers to some remarks I wanted to make about the use of sources, but with the few Darawis I have spoken to, they all downplayed this and didn't see much organizational merit or value or leadership value or networking value to the mosque. They basically saw it as a space where it just happened. So in a way, the mosque seemed to have provided a space for mobilization, but not of social networking or brokerage as such. Now the regime has very much made an effort to basically see in people in the mosque, leading the mosque, the imam, what's his name, Sheikh Sayasna, as the conspirator of the whole thing. And so they started to target him as being responsible for the uprising. And the people I talked to basically dismissed that and said, well, Sayasna, in the end of the day, it was happening in his mosque. He had to take sides, but he was not leading us. And the same goes for the Mufti of Daraa. Now, both people got into great trouble for being perceived as the conspirators of the uprising, but in fact were much more part of the uprising like anybody else. Now, that doesn't mean that the mosque didn't play a role. I think it did. It was an important social space, but I wouldn't add agency or to it on its own. Now to your more fundamental criticism on social movement theory or mobilization, or at least the way I applied it or I understood it. Yes, of course, all these factors you mention about poverty, about the collapse of the agricultural sector in the Hauran, structural factors, unemployment, all that matters. But I never said it didn't. And in fact, that's what I alluded to in the beginning of my talk. I think we should be talking about the causal and structural factors that explain the uprisings throughout the Arab world, including Syria. And these factors do play definitely a role. But I don't think that they explain the when, how, and why of collective mobilization as it occurred in March, on March the 18th. In Daraa and subsequently. So in a way, the question is rather, and it's a kind of funny way of agreeing with what you are saying, but the question rather was and has been, why didn't people revolt earlier based on these structural inequalities and massive poverty and unemployment and so on and so on. Poverty alone, inequality alone, doesn't explain why people mobilize and how and when. And in fact, many poor, unprivileged people in places like Daraa or similar to Daraa, they don't revolt and they don't collectively mobilize. Fighters sent to Iraq, I did consider that possibility. And I got conflicting answers, but in the end basically some of them confirming what you are saying, that indeed Dara was a recruiting ground for people going to volunteering and going to Iraq to join the jihad against the US occupation. But what eventually persuaded me not to include that is a couple of accounts I got from families who were living in villages where particularly people had gone to Iraq. Small villages like Sil, close to Dara. And they said, well, it hasn't been the factors. These guys weren't around during our mobilization. And on top of that, most of them, if not all, were in prison. So even the regime was making allegations that certain Salafi groups or jihadi groups were involved, but in fact they knew they couldn't have been involved. They were all in their prisons. So that's why I dismissed that line of interpretation. But based on the kind of fragmented information we have, that may have been a wrong decision. We will see when the opportunity arises to actually properly, with field work, investigate all these matters in Dara and indeed Syria as a whole. Yeah, I think I addressed most of your comments, but probably didn't resolve all of them. So thanks very much.
Tarek, did you have?
I'll take a little problem with what you're saying right near the end, that, if people are poor, and why aren't they rebelling? I've been collecting folk humor from... Can you not hear me?
People say that you should.
Okay, sorry. Can I sit next to you?
Sure.
I was collecting some folk humor about the dictatorships in Pakistan, and I won't repeat it here, it's not repeatable in public. The number of the rebellious, the undermining of the structures within Syria and Pakistan through folk humor in its absurdity was very clear. People were rebelling all the time, as almost like the atoms of water are heating up. Perhaps the steam hasn't come out. Now, what I found in your thing were two things which I found quite difficult to come to terms with. You've ignored an economic position, and you've sort of said, well, of course, these are parts of a process, but also the fact that there is an external force that has an effect upon the internal developments. Just America, its allies, their regional requirements, that they also affect the way that internal processes develop and change. How do you think that was going on? And also, in a way, when we look at that complex process of history, where does that go? By concentrating on a theory of social movements and trying to understand a whole process, it becomes almost ahistorical. It doesn't just start now, it has started a very, very long time ago. Its expression is today, and it's not its conclusion, surely. But how do all these processes that we're witnessing affect each other? How can there be then the logical thing that there has to be a desire for change and people are asking for something? I've seen the movements develop in Kashmir, brutally put down in their tens and hundreds of thousands. And yes, people were poor, and yes, movements suddenly emerged. And they're not dissimilar situation to what we're witnessing all across this region. But there was something uniting all those people. There was a desire, a demand, a dream, and I don't know how a theory that tries to explain this complex phenomena can actually ignore an ideological requirement of people. And it is hunger, it is for sure democratic and human rights. And just final thing I'd like to sort of link on, that there is a role of criminals in derailing a process. The role of a criminal gangs, not just here, but all across the world. They're the easiest ones who are taken in when movements develop. Now, it seemed to me you were almost glorifying them.
Well, thank you very much.
response to your what appears to be your own research on folk humor, which I would actually find very interesting, and it's something I didn't really touch on in my presentation of the bare bones of my paper. But in fact, the ridicule and humor and sharing stories and gossip and stuff like that on about the regime and about its main incumbents, I think has been crucially important. And in fact, I argue in my paper that indeed these social networks provided also a space for the exchange of thoughts and exchange of humor and cynicism and about the regime. And that maybe partially, at least discursively, also addresses your criticisms regarding the ahistorical approach I'm taking. What Scott calls hidden transcripts, which were actually expressed for the first time at such a scale in the open starting in March 2011. These hidden transcripts had been developing already for years or decades, and responded to real events and historical events. So the kind of shared thoughts and the disgust with the regime didn't just happen on the 18th of March, of course, or even solely in relation to how these women were treated in prison and the children and so on. No, these referred back to a shared discourse, and I emphasize the word shared, that already provided the script, if you like. And what is so striking about the uprising in Dara, I find, is that for years on end, decades on end, Syria hadn't had a proper independent, autonomous demonstration. Nobody had made a banner and put a slogan on it out of his own kind of creativity, or very rarely so. And then suddenly you see these banners popping up everywhere with very funny and sometimes very hard-hitting slogans. And where does that come from? And I think it comes from partially because of a kind of bricolage, borrowing from Egyptian protesters and Tunisian protesters. Initially, they actually adopted a lot of their slogans, but subsequently and very rapidly, they came up with much more inventive stuff. And I think that was literally borrowed from that hidden transcripts that had been shared for all these years before that. And I think the social networks were the place where these hidden transcripts were being shared. Now, while I do acknowledge the kind of challenge that such sharing of folk humor and cynicism and so on, and criticism, the challenge that poses in the long term. And it's also something that Asif Bayat, for example, emphasizes, the kind of the kind of small-scale politics that slowly, collectively, somehow bring about changes. But let's face it, with cracking jokes, you don't bring about the collapse of an authoritarian regime like the Ba'ath Party or regime in Syria. It really takes something else, and it's something else started at least to emerge in Dara via the mechanisms that I described. About praising criminals for their role, or I can't remember how you put it, or hailing them. First of all, I'm not really interested in what it means to be a criminal in Syria. It's not a term that I use in police terms or in rule of law kind of terminology. It's just a word that I use because they are involved in petty crime that are being prosecuted and persecuted as such by the regime. And as I said earlier, that doesn't mean that they are, criminals according to the rule of law standards. First of all, they may have not done anything in the first place that is, criminal according to our legal understandings. Secondly, they may have been involved in a petty crime and being punished disproportionately. So where does that leave them as criminal? Thirdly, they might even, as actually happened systematically, they might have been tortured as petty criminals, just as political activists were. And then on top of that, you may actually have a discourse that actually justifies their criminal activities, which also were being expressed by some Syrians, particularly in the border region with Lebanon, who actually said, well, they may be criminals, but they are quite patriotic and they have a good intention in the end. So I think all these notions, and it deserves to be looked at more closely, but it's very messy. But the reason why I brought it to the fore is because whatever the exact nature of criminality, it does bring about networks and resources and skills that come in quite crucially in mobilization.
Okay, I have Rami down. I had Rami Hori down, then we'd go to the back of the room.
She's raising her hand since half an hour.
I can't.
My name is Reinoud, I'm a journalist here. I hear you grappling with the problem of sourcing, and it's something I think we're all grappling with when we're trying to assess the situation. I was wondering if you could expand a bit on what limitation this means of sourcing through YouTube and Skype places on your research.
Well, thank you for that question.
What I've done is indeed an imperfect effort in doing research, and actually usually I would not write such a paper if it hadn't been possible to do field work. Now in this case I find it's different. First of all, I think it is important to develop an argument, an analytical argument based on the information that we have, just to better understand the uprisings, in this case the Syrian uprising, or at least its onset. But secondly, I think it's from a more politically engaged point of view. I think it's important that academicians engage with current affairs, if not just to counter ill-informed or even worse informed analysis provided by media or others. Now, I did struggle with a lot of problems because I relied on a lot of YouTube footage. So a lot of the kind of analysis of slogans and the framing comes from there. I managed to speak to at least a couple of people in Dara using Skype and email, and some people who had recently fled Dara. And on top of that, some secondary literature and state statistics and so on. And well, let's face it, my own gut feeling that developed by having been in Syria a couple of times working on other things. Now, particularly the social media stuff and the YouTube, the use of YouTube sources is problematic and controversial. Now, you have one side that, as you're all aware of, that have all tried to reduce Arab uprisings as the Twitter revolution and the Facebook revolution. Syrian activists have hailed the use of social media on YouTube as basically allowing the outside world a direct connection to what is happening in Syria. And I actually remember what's it called? This Top Gun satirical series on YouTube developed by activists in Damascus, where Bashar is celebrating his birthday, and then he is being given a present by Shabir, his helper, of only, I can't remember exactly, but only 50 people killed that day. And Bashar is disappointed, and then his the ghost of his father Hafiz appears and says, well, you have to kill them all. And Bashar responds, but I can't kill them all because there's YouTube and stuff and the whole world will see it, and I can't do what you did in Hama in 1982. So also, emphasizing the importance of YouTube and social media. Now, the opposite view on this has been developing and basically argues, well, this is all unreliable stuff. It's all manipulated and so on. And not coincidentally, that's also the regime's version of that argument. Now, I've had extensive discussions with people from the BBC in London who, it's called, it has a kind of Orwellian name, it's called the User-Generated Content Analysis Unit. Something like that. They have a nice acronym for it. Basically what they do, they're a bunch of people who are actually given the job to monitor Facebook and social media, and now particularly related to the Arab uprisings. What they do is trying to figure out the authenticity of these YouTube footage. And they gave me lots of examples where activist footage was actually manipulated. It was being set in Iraq instead of Syria, or less ambitiously, the suggestion was created that protests had continued by again uploading old footage, stuff like that, or more ambiguously, just a mass grave was being shown and used by all sides to blame responsibility on the other side. And there's no way you can tell who actually were responsible for these killings. Now, you could kind of lean back in resignation and say, well, there's nothing to be known in Syria because we can't go there, and end of story. I think for the reasons I cited earlier, that's an unacceptable view. And secondly, I think with the use, in my case, and I was lucky, of this BBC unit, I shifted through YouTube footage and relied on stuff that they basically found to be convincing. And they use all sorts of methods. They use people from Dara to analyze the accents and the dialects, the kind of the position of the sun, and compare that to the claims of what time the protest or killings or whatever took place. Satellite imagery, major buildings and mosques shown in the YouTube footage. Now, on top of that, activists also start to realize that their stuff is being discredited by the regime as unreliable. So they developed mechanisms in response to make it more reliable, by showing newspapers with a date on it, by doing an overvoice and explaining exactly what was happening, using local dialects to make that claim, and also let people talk to them or talk in the footage, showing clear imagery of recognizable buildings and mosques and squares, what have you. So it got a bit better, and on top of that, and more from a discursive and framing perspective, I still think it's important to even if it's manipulated, it's important to see how activists want the world to see what is going on in Syria. Now, revolutionaries, by definitions, are people who want to get rid of the status quo and the way the present is being organized. So it's rather odd to blame them for portraying reality in a different way than it is at this stage. So I think actually, from social movement theory perspective, or those studying uprisings and revolutions, this has been a fantastic opportunity to actually read the scripts and the transcripts of activists, and digitally. So my answer in short, yes, the sources are problematic. There are ways to deal with them. There is some sense of optimism about these sources having improved. But at the end of the day, yes, I have to make arbitrary decisions, and there is a need for field work.
We're beginning to run a little bit short on time, and I have a series of people who I have down. But was there somebody else in the back? Did I miss somebody who raised their hand earlier? Can you come to a microphone?
Thank you very much. Also a PhD student, I dealt with social movement theories, doesn't work at all. Let's say, I think it doesn't. I want to come back on the issue of socio-economic reason and the structure, because the way you put it, why did it spread to Syria? Dara is not different to other side of the story. Also, I mean, socio-economic issues are very important to understand why suburbs of Damascus and Aleppo are revolting and not the center of the bourgeoisie, which is still supporting the regime, as well as the periphery. This is really the social issue in Syria. The social characteristic of the revolution in Syria is clear. So we cannot, the way agriculture was completely left out, the way people that came from the countryside to cities and the suburb shouldn't be left out, I think. And not once in your talk you spoke about neoliberal policies of Bashar Assad, accelerated especially in the period of Bashar Assad in 2000, but started in 91 by Hafiz al-Assad, that played a humongous role, because the bulk of the protesters are rural people displaced, and people that lost their job with the privatizations, started with Bashar Assad especially, and which benefited to a close bourgeoisie. And also, he didn't speak about the political struggle that happened before 2012.
Sorry?
The political struggle from activists that started in 2000 with the different clubs, they play a role today in the revolution as well, and the Kurdish Intifada. So it wasn't in a way in 2004, it wasn't in a way something new to people to mobilize, but so political struggle was before present as well in Daraya. You had in the suburbs of Damascus people organizing against the war in Iraq. So you had political struggle from before. But why it started this? Lenin used to say, in years nothing happened, but in weeks, years can happen. So I think there is your answer. The events in Egypt and Tunis was the étincelle, as we say, but reasons are present. So socio-economic effects plus political struggle in the past should not be put aside, and Dara should be connected to the rest of the struggle. Thank you.
You should have had 3 hours to address everything about the Syrian revolution, obviously.
Yeah, but in my own defense, with my title,
The word onset. I'm not claiming to give you a comprehensive account of the Syrian uprising or revolution, what you may call it. First of all, about this choice to look at onset. Again, I don't see the Syrian uprising as one event. In fact, the whole idea of a revolution as one event is not tenable, because it implies an assumption that events just kind of in a unilinear fashion lead to the outcome, and then the outcomes are being read back to explain what happened in the beginning. I don't think it works that way. I don't think that the people in Dara knew exactly what they were doing in terms of what we are now, the situation we are now in. So I think you have to disaggregate it to start with, and accept and acknowledge the fact that this is messy. There may have been a rebellion. There indeed may have been a phase of armed struggle. It may be both. So I don't think the Syrian uprising can be explained as one event, and that's why to start the analysis, but not to end it, I looked at the onset, because I think the early say 3-4 months or so had their specific quality. and that need to be explained. Now that may have affected subsequent months, which I think it did, and I didn't really go into this. But for example, you could argue that the kind of leaderless quality of mobilization at the early stages quite suited the activists well at the early stages, but became a problem subsequently. Because then from, say, the August onwards, or July onwards, people basically started to present themselves as claiming leadership of the revolution and wanting to coordinate it and lead it. And of course all of them suffered by definition from the weakness that they appeared as wanting to claim something that had occurred and started without them. So there was a kind of sense of lack of legitimacy built in from the first stages. So that's one example. But I don't think we can analyze the whole thing as one event in reference to structural factors. About these structural causes, about socioeconomic structures and the factors that you mentioned, of course they are important. Of course we have to look at them. But again, I don't think they explain the timing and the ways in which and the where that mobilization occurred. And for that you need to look at some sort of approach that kind of marries agency and immediate conditions relevant to mobilization. I think to some extent social movement theory does provide some concepts and insights into that. Now, a lot of social movement theory is not relevant at all, if not only for the fact that, I don't know, but probably 50% of it is about mobilization by the gay movement in the United States. I'm not so sure about the relevance for Dada. So I think you can borrow and be inspired by this approach, but you don't have to uncritically adopt the whole thing. So, causal factors, people who were involved in human rights activism, I understood you were referring to them, or were involved in more conventional political activities and paid a heavy price for that. Now, I met many of them and I have great respect for them, but I don't think they had any influence in what happened in Dara. In fact, they weren't even talking about Dara themselves, and even refused to talk about Dara themselves until 3 months after the events in Dara. Because for them, Dara was not the way they envisaged Syria to change. They were talking about the Mujtama al-Madani and civil society, not about the Mujtama al-Ahli, a bunch of tribes and clans. That's how they saw it. So I have a lot of respect for them. And they did have their demonstration, they did take risk and pay the price for it. But they were not the driving factors, and certainly not at the onset. Now subsequently, and quite cleverly, I think, and to their credit, I think they capitalized and rode the waves of mobilization very well. And they actually helped things like, helped activists to frame their protests. And I think also leaned on their experiences. For example, in the campaign to release Riyad al-Turk and the kind of courthouse slogans they had, or sit-ins in front of courthouses and so on. All sorts of forms of challenges and obedience. I think all that came in was important, a repertoire that was being partly adopted and integrated by activism later on. But I don't think they were at the onset of the mobilization. I'm sorry.
So lastly, I think we have 3 more questions from here. Maybe we can all give your question and we'll respond all at once. I think it was Rami, Sammy, and up front. You have questions?
Let me address first the question of petty criminals. Actually, I think there is a strategic planning by many of the Arab countries to criminalize the whole population. This happens when you underpay your employees. When the employees don't get salaries, living salaries, which means they're going to be, which means that they're going to be bribed.
So everybody has to participate in that. I think everybody here, this population here is criminal. He must have bribed somebody to get a license, to get so that he doesn't get a ticket. So this is at the outset. And how does this serve the government? Anybody that stands up to them, eventually they have a long record. You know, you have committed all these crimes. So this way they think that nobody will stand up to them. Now, the next thing is about your perception about the Syrian revolution. There were, of course, a simmering, people were getting poorer.
We're running out of time. Can you just ask a question? We need to collect 3 other questions.
Yeah, let me continue, please. Okay. I'll be to the point. I'll be very brief. There was simmering, of course, feeling about of the need of change, the need to change. People were getting poorer, and there were so injustices, corruption, and so on. But the government also was promising them that they're going to change, and the people were waiting for that because they didn't really want to go through all this bloody struggle. So there was an anticipation, and this is the reason for the popularity of the government at that time. Now, the Daraa event is really very similar to the Mohammed Bouazizi in Tunisia. It's a matter of dignity, because before it, there was an incident in Damascus where there was a problem between a policeman and the person. But this was, the Minister of Interior came himself to settle down that. But in Daraa, nobody came. The thing here, they kept stepping on their dignity, and this is the reason for the spark in Daraa. Thank you.
Actually, I'll skip my question. I'll leave the last one.
No, I was going to skip it. Please go ahead. I'm just repeating because the question hasn't been answered. We need to return to the external influence. The question was asked before, but not really answered. How can you really ignore where's the place of external influence in your argument? The US, just to name one of them. And is it not really at least an ethical question to kind of ignore the wider geopolitical context and how it plays along with the revolution?
Thanks. Well, thanks, Reinoud, for posing an interesting question on specifically focusing on the onset, which is obviously sort of highlighting the difficulties of answering that. But my question is, how unique is that? I still don't have traction on that. You've mentioned, you've talked about some statistics and so forth. Part of me feels like, well, is it really Daraa and the social network where this makes it unique, which we still don't know? Why didn't the revolution or the uprising start in the northeast, for example? And as much, what if, for example, have you taken into account the mistakes made by the army or the police, which has triggered? And I know, at least from Egypt, or in Egypt, when they started on January 25th, they were not planning for a sit-in for 18 days. In fact, the next sit-in was April 6th scheduled for, and things took a life of its own. But just quickly, I know, for example, in Suez City, the army mishandled, or the police mishandled a big situation. They killed 2 people, and they refused to give their bodies, which triggered a major reaction, for example. So my question is, it really coming from structural conditions that exists, that's uniquely specific to Daraa, or is it just because of an accident in the sense that unexpected events taking sort of its toll on a very ripe condition for a revolution to happen? And I'm wondering, just to get your reflection, just pushing that little bit, sort of a comparison, not only within sort of Syria, but with these onsets that are happening in the Arab world. It's a very rich case. In Tunisia, Egypt, Yemen, and Libya. I'm wondering if you could sort of reflect on that. I know this is not the purpose of your paper, but it would be sort of useful to get your sort of views on that as well. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much for your rich comments. I'm really benefiting from this. The remark made by the gentleman over there about petty criminals and regimes criminalizing entire populations. Everybody's a criminal. To some extent, I would agree with that, and it underscores my point on the very slippery notion of crime in the first place. But there's a difference between a citizen paying a bribe to get, I don't know, a real estate permit or whatever, and somebody running even a small-scale kind of racketeering system or selling on a daily basis stolen mobile phones or smuggling. And it will be very hard conceptually to exactly put the finger where the difference is, but I think that there's a difference in degree. The promise of change. I can't remember about your second remark. Sorry, I have to leave that now. About the external influence and the role of the US, whether I'm being unethical not to consider that. My paper isn't about that. And secondly, I would welcome any IR scholar to come forward and write that paper. Very much needed. I'm not pretending to say the last word on the Arab uprisings here, and not even on the Syrian uprisings. But as far as I can see, when it comes to Dada's citizens and their decision making on whether to go into the streets and defy a regime with a record to crush people without mercy, I don't think the United States comes in at all. I have no idea what you are referring to. Now, Sami's remarks, they are the trickiest. Thank you, Sami. How unique is Dada? I initially started this project because I wanted to understand why mobilization occurred where. And very quickly you end up with an argument saying it happened because it had to happen there. And it's actually not something that I intended to do when I started it. I just took it for granted that it happened there. Or that it started there in Dara. I'm not sure how to resolve that, and in response, because other people raised this issue as well, including the editors of the journal in which it's going to be published, I extended the argument and tried to look at other early rises which had intensive and large-scale mobilization very quickly in the first 3 months. And I have been looking at Deir ez-Zor, at Idlib, at Homs in particular. And this is still work in progress. And I find it incredibly hard to get the similar quality of data that I found on Dada, which also explains a little bit why I'm sticking to Dada. And I don't know why that's the case. I find it very hard to get the similar stuff. But I do have suspicions that these places also share the network characteristics that I think have been important in Dada. But then the case selection of which cities do you look at is also problematic, because based on what benchmark can I decide what were the most intense mobilizers? So I'm struggling with that. Your suggestions are very welcome. Mistakes made by security forces. Yes, of course, the crucial, but also in this story. It's not just only the mistakes, but I think probably within the regime, the local security chief will have gotten a lot of trouble for what he did. But I think it has been crucial that it was not just his mistakes, but the way in which the actions and the behavior of the security forces were interpreted by Darawis that was crucial. Because again, they could also have taken it as a very strong message that, don't play around with this regime. We basically, they're not going to allow happy-clappy Tahrir square kind of demonstrations or sit-ins. And they didn't. And I think that has to come from somewhere. Comparing with onsets throughout the region, tricky one. Potentially interesting, but problematic from a methodological point of view. First of all, I would definitely include an analysis based on how Darawi's, or indeed Syrians, if we get more ambitious, interpreted events happening in Egypt and Tunisia, including their interpretation of why did it happen in a remote place like in Tunisia. But I would be very I would warn against a comparison in the way that we treat all these onsets as case studies, because they aren't. Because one case study was affected by the other, so they're highly interrelated. So you can't treat them as ABC and just look at variables and see how they differ and share certain characteristics. Nevertheless, it can be done, but I think it takes a more complex approach. I think I addressed your point.
Thank you, and I think we're coming out of time. I wanted to thank you all for your very serious and informed questions, and thank Reinoud for coming out, answering them, and being part of our lecture series.
Yeah, thanks for coming.